the thing about Nic is he's so knowledgeable. Oops. He's so knowledgeable, and he is incredibly smart. He's probably our premier historian in Charleston. And the great thing is he's also an excellent speaker, and he gives a really engaging, wonderful talk. So we're gonna be in for a treat tonight. Nic, as most of you know that follow Charleston history, is the public historian at the Charleston County Public Library. But that really only sort of scratches the surface. He's an interdisciplinary historian and a consummate researcher who knows about just about everything related to Charleston and the Low Country. He's from Greenville County. He attended the University of South Carolina for a bachelor and master's degrees. He went on to Indiana University for a PhD in musicology. And he came back to South Carolina. Oops, I hear something saying the audio is breaking up. Sorry about that. But he worked, I think, first at the South Carolina Historical Society as an archivist, is where I first met you. He's also been an adjunct faculty member at the College of Charleston. He's consulted for the city of Charleston. But for many, many years, he's been at the Charleston County Public Library as their public historian and does many, many programs. He runs what's called the Charleston Time Machine. And if you've never heard of it, it is a blog and a webcast, all sorts of stuff rolled into one. So he does the audio, the writing, the research, all this stuff on some really amazing topics. So small snippets that I think we're all hoping that he'll put those snippets together in publications someday, especially on the walled city. So pertinent to tonight, Nic was a founding member of our Walled City Task Force, the Mayor's Walled City Task Force, which was established in 2005. And he's really been sort of the backbone of the research with the walled city since then. So we are very excited and to hear from him. So with that, Nic, I'll just let you go and I'll be quiet. We're going to have questions at the end, so put in your chat if you have a question for Nic, and we'll get to it at the end.
Okay. So good evening, everybody. And I hope you can all see my screen. Is that working properly, Catherine? Yes, okay, great. Thank you, Catherine, for that great introduction. And I'm very happy to be part of this series with some very distinguished people talking about other cities that were heavily fortified. And so my goal tonight is to try to put Charleston's early fortifications in that global context of France and Spain and England competing for empire in the New World. And so for many of us who live here in Charleston, for those of you who are tour guides, you know, we really spend most of our life thinking about Charleston as if it's the center of the universe. And of course it's not. And we have to compare our fortifications and our history to other places that have similar but very different trajectories. So last week in this series, we heard about St. Augustine, and I unfortunately was doing another program on the web and I missed that, but I'm looking forward to going back and watching the video. And I'm going to make some references to Spain and to France. So Catherine is absolutely right that places like Quebec and St. Augustine and Bermuda are part of this continuation of fortifications. It goes far beyond Charleston, and what was going on in those other places absolutely impacted what was going on with the military thinking, the defensive thinking of early Charleston. So I want to try to give you tonight a snapshot of Charleston's first era of fortifications, not the earliest fortifications, but the first era in which there was a system of fortifications around the town. And as you can see in my title, I've defined it as 1703 to 1723. And for those of you who've heard me talk about this topic before, you probably don't recall me talking about 1723 because that was never really on my historical radar. But hopefully by the end of this program, you'll understand why I'm really starting to focus on things that happened here in 1723. So we'll get there in just a moment. So as Catherine mentioned a moment ago, I want to remind you of the Walled City Task Force blog site, which I started in 2007. And I'm still adding stuff to and still updating it. So if you're interested in learning more about other parts of the fortified history of urban Charleston, check out walledcitytaskforce.org. And I am posting essays on there periodically, and there is still a massive bibliography of things you can check out, both in print and in manuscript sources that relate to this topic. And I've got a timeline on there from the 1670s to the present. Actually, I need to update that timeline based on what I'm going to tell you tonight, which is kind of my latest theories about when these early walls came down. So for those of you who are not real familiar with colonial era Charleston or Charleston early history in general, let me just point out that we can define that century of colonial era South Carolina, that is from the 1670s to the 1770s. We can divide it into three periods. The proprietary government period, when the lords proprietors who owned Carolina appointed deputies to represent them here on the ground in Charleston. So that lasted from 1670 until December of 1719, at which time there was a revolution. And because of that revolution of December 1719, we started a new phase where the British Crown Authority, that is in the name of King George, started a provisional royal government. The people here wanted to be under royal government directly, not under the government of the Lords Proprietors who were kind of making a mess of Carolina, in the colonists' opinion. So from 1721 to 1730, there is a provisional royal government here. So we're not quite a royal colony, but we're not quite a proprietary colony. And that was a decade of confusion, really the most confusing period in South Carolina's early history, because nobody was quite sure who was in charge, and the colony really did almost collapse in the late 1720s, but more about that at a different time. And finally, the royal government, which started officially in December of 1730 and continued until September of 1775. The royal government was much, much more stable, much more economically viable, and a period for which we have much better records. But in terms of fortifications, these are very different eras. The fortifications of the proprietary era were very different from the royal era fortifications. And tonight we're going to focus on proprietary fortifications that really appear to have been dismantled during that provisional royal government in the 1720s. So many of you know that Charlestown was laid out according to the map you see on the screen here, the so-called Grand Model of Charleston, which was created about the year 1672. It was ordered to be done in the summer of 1672. So sometime shortly after that, the peninsula, the lower part of the peninsula, is divided into over 300 town lots and about a dozen streets. There's no fortification in the plan. So fortifications were not part of the original town plan. And there were not fortifications in the town when settlement started here in the earliest days. And I want to make that clear because a lot of people have assumed, well, Charleston was heavily fortified from the start. And that turns out not to be the case. In the early decades, there was a lot of foot dragging about protecting the city, apparently. And there's a good paper trail for that. And I've been writing about that recently on my essays about the earliest fortifications. So for example, the map you're looking at here, drawn by Jean Boyd in the spring of 1686, shows some rudimentary fortifications along what turns out to be East Bay Street, facing the Cooper River. And we don't know anything about these fortifications besides this map because there are no legislative records from this era. So we don't know when these fortifications were built along East Bay Street, when they came down exactly, what they were made out of, because there's no paper trail. But starting in the 1690s, the early 1690s, there's a much more robust paper trail. And from 1692 onward, we have almost all of the journals of the lower house of assembly. In our bicameral government, the lower house of assembly was called the Commons House, and they did all the heavy lifting. They paid for things, they planned the budget, they planned the defense of the colony. So I've been through all of those early legislative records, and that is the principal source from which I'm getting the information that I share with you this evening. So another thing to keep in mind, especially if you heard last week's program about St. Augustine, England and Spain are technically at peace from the founding of Carolina until the autumn of 1702. So even though the English colonists of early Carolina are not on friendly terms with the Spanish in Florida, and they held a lot of animosity towards St. Augustine and vice versa. St. Augustine would like Carolina to disappear because turns out we were encroaching on their real estate. There was no declared war during this time period. So there was no emergent reason, no very strong reason for early Carolina colonists to fear a Spanish invasion, at least during the early years of the colony. But that changed to a certain extent in 1689, when England declared war against France and vice versa. So King William's War, also known as the 9 Years' War in Europe, wrapped up in the autumn of 1697. That was a war that involved England and her colonies in the New World, and France and her colonies in New World. So Spain did not get into this. So South Carolina and Charleston specifically, we didn't rush out and build fortifications during this time period because of a fear of attack from St. Augustine. The fear was that the French in Saint-Domingue, in the West Indies, might attack Bermuda or the Bahamas or Carolina. And some of that did happen. So our greatest fear was of French invasion, but the French were so far off. They were not yet in New Orleans. They were not yet in Biloxi. So there was no real emergency to build fortifications. And so I've done some essays recently on over the past year, I've done some essays on the Walled City Task Force blog site about the earliest eras of fortification, the Boyd map that I showed you just a moment ago, and what those fortifications might have been. And then I recently did an essay about the beginning of what was originally called the Wharf Wall, a solid brick wall on the east side of East Bay Street, planning for which began in 1694, and maybe they started putting bricks on top of bricks in 1696. And that project dragged on for several years and was not originally part of a defensive network. It was originally just to create a wharf out of East Bay Street. And then once that wharf wall got built, it was kind of adopted, co-opted into the defensive fortification network in the early 1700s. So I've already done an essay about that. And recently, just a month or so ago, I wrote an essay about the beginning of Granville Bastion, which started in 1696 on paper. And by 1697, they're starting on the ground at what is now 40 East Bay Street. That is under what is now the Mizroon House, the headquarters of the historic Charleston Foundation, which I'm proposing was originally just the first bastion of a 4-bastion fort, just like the Castillo de San Marco in St. Augustine. But that 4-bastion fort never got finished. But more about that in a future essay. And I'm going to be coming out this summer with another essay about the beginning of the Half Moon Battery in 1700, perhaps 1701. That Half Moon Battery at the east end of Broad Street was finished in the autumn of 1702. But again, it's not part of a system of fortifications yet. There is no grand network of fortifications around the town at this time. And those of you might remember back in 2008, 2009, we excavated part of a redan or V-shaped salient angle at the southeast end of Trad Street. Well, that was something that got started around 1700 or 1701. And when it got started, it was not part of a system of fortifications to encircle the town. It was kind of a freestanding bastion at the time. So after those beginning essays into fortification. Then things changed. As I mentioned a moment ago, King William's War ended in the autumn of 1697. And then the French began moving into the mainland of North America. French colonists and soldiers began settling at Biloxi and Mobile, and then St. Augustine a decade later. And that worried the people here in Carolina because there was nothing except the Indians between us and the French. And then in England, they're beginning to talk of a new war with France, and this time also Spain. And that war finally did erupt late in 1702. But before the war erupted, Governor James Moore is saying, we need to be prepared and defend Charleston in case there's a new war between the European powers. And then King William III died in March of 1702, and his successor, Queen Anne, declared war against France and Spain, and it's the beginning of what we know as Queen Anne's War. And so this is a global war for empire. England, France, and Spain, and all of their collective colonies are battling each other for territory. And this ignites new conversations in Charleston about defending the capital of South Carolina. And you might remember that Governor James Moore took a contingent of white men and enslaved people and Native Americans down to St. Augustine in November, December of 1702 and tried to sack the city, and he was not successful. So it was really kind of like going down there and smacking the hornet's nest and running away. They knew that there would be retribution. So conversations began for new fortifications here in urban Charleston in January of the new year, 1703. And looking into the journal of the Commons House of Assembly, as I was describing a moment ago, these are manuscript journals that survive in the State Archive in Columbia that I've taken extensive notes from. The Commons House started debating various aspects of that raid on St. Augustine and how to improve the military preparations here in Charleston in case the Spanish are kind of angry and come after us, which they absolutely were going to do. So the legislature appointed a committee to do what they said to, quote, make a platform to make Charlestown more defensible, to make a plat, I'm sorry, not a platform, a plat, to draw some kind of plan, to draw the town and figure out how do we make the town more defensible in case the Spanish, our neighbors in Florida, decide to attack us. And so that committee came back in February of 1703, and they made a report to the Commons House, and they said that a closed fort or an enclosed fort should be built on Windmill Point for the security of Charlestown. So Windmill Point was the place that you and I know as Fort Johnson on James Island. So kind of the northeast corner of James Island. So build a fort out there so that anybody coming into the harbor intent on attacking Charleston would have to get by that fort first. So this is the first conversation about beginning what became Fort Johnson, but that wasn't built until 1708. And at the same time, the committee suggested that there be an entrenchment on the back part of the town for the security of the town. This is the first idea of surrounding the town with a system of fortifications. And if you're not familiar with that term entrenchment, it's a military architecture term in which you build something like this. So an entrenchment is a quick and easy method of fortification in which you dig a moat or ditch and take the earth that you've removed and pile it up to make an earthen embank or entrenchment behind which you can mount cannon and defenders to defend a town or line from an enemy approach. So an entrenchment is a term that means both the big pile or bank of earth and the trench or moat or ditch in front of it. So because there's no natural stone within about 80 miles of Charleston, this was the quickest and most expedient and least expensive method of fortifying the town. So entrenchments are standard kind of siege warfare technology in a place where where you have to build quickly, or there's no available stone, or you don't have the time or money to build out of brick. So Charleston built entrenchments, or in 1703, they're planning to build entrenchments. And the image I just showed you a moment ago was from a 1688 textbook on how to build fortifications. And here's another image from a 1691 textbook on how to build fortifications. And by the way, lots of 17th century and 18th century textbooks about fortifications have been digitized and are available in Google Books or other places online. So you can have a field day researching early fortifications like this on the internet. So what we built looked something like this. You dig a trench and you pile up that volume of earth to make a platform behind which musketeers and cannoneers can hide. So in March 1703, just a few weeks after that report was made, Nathaniel Johnson finally took office as governor. And I say finally because Nathaniel Johnson was the most experienced soldier in South Carolina. He moved to South Carolina from Antigua in 1689, but he was eligible to be governor, but he was loyal to King James. He was appointed by King James, and he refused to serve under the administration of King William III. King William died, and news of that arrived here. So Nathaniel Johnson raised his hand and said, "Hey, I'm available to be governor now if you still want me." And so, of course, they wanted him because he was an experienced soldier. So he took the reins of government in the spring of 1703. Just a few months later, intelligence news arrives here in Charleston that both French and Spanish forces separately have attacked New Providence, Bahamas, and sacked the town of Nassau. And people here in Charleston are thinking, well, we might be next. We really need to get prepared. But the legislature was not in session at the time. And just a few weeks later, by late November, early December, Governor Nathaniel Johnson received credible intelligence that the Spanish and the French were outfitting a fleet to attack Charleston directly. And when he got that news, he called the legislature back to Charleston. So he sent word out to the plantations that the legislature was going to meet in an emergency session. All the legislators came to Charleston, and after the governor raised an alarm. And on the 8th of December, the governor addressed them and said something about the nature of the emergency that had summoned everyone to town. Unfortunately, his speech given on December 8th doesn't survive, so we don't know precisely what he said. But we know that he urged the Commons House of Assembly to consult some methods for the security, the better security of this province of South Carolina. So the very next day, the Commons House of Assembly is thinking, okay, the governor told us to do something. What are we going to do? They debated the question whether or not it was the opinion of the Commons House that an entrenchment should be drawn through part of Charleston for the defense of it. So instead of just defending the waterfront, maybe we can defend some part of the peninsula, that town plan of Charlestown. Maybe not all of the grand model, but some part of the grand model can be surrounded by an entrenchment. So, they've got a map of Charleston and they're drawing lines. And the majority of the Commons House said, yes, we need to build an entrenchment, a series of lines around the town. So they ordered a committee to go out and view the ground. So walk around Charleston, pick the ground that we are going to fortify and the part of the town that we are not going to fortify. And as it turns out, it looks like if you walk around the lines that they fortified, it looks like they decided to encircle the highest and driest 62 acres of urban Charleston. So just a few days later, in the ensuing days of this emergency session of the legislature, that committee came back after viewing the ground and said that they are of the opinion that Samuel Dubourdieu and Mr. Lamboise should be sent for and have their opinions on the entrenchments. And these names are horribly misspelled in the original records, but we're talking about Samuel Dubourdieu, better known in this state as Debidoux, as in Debidoux, South Carolina, Dubourdieu, and James Longbois. These are two French Huguenot immigrants to South Carolina. These are not professional soldiers, not engineers. These are men who live on plantations outside of Charleston, but they grew up in France and they are well-educated Frenchmen. They apparently have some kind of experience or some kind of knowledge about fortifications that nobody else in town has. So the governor and the legislature has decided to recall Mr. Dubourdieu and Mr. Lambois and ask them to come to Charleston to be consultants. And on the 17th of December, Mr. Dubourdieu laid before the Commons House of Assembly a draft or a plan of the fortifications. So he apparently drew the plan for encircling Charleston with an entrenchment. And the Commons House ordered a committee to go out and to supervise the laying out of those lines on the ground and starting the entrenchments, starting to dig the moats and to create those banks of earth. And they knew that they were going to be cutting through private property. And in the name of protecting the greater good at that time, they basically exercised their power of eminent domain and said, yes, we're going to confiscate people's property temporarily. And we'll keep a list of whose property we have damaged and we'll pay them off later. And that's, something they did in later paperwork, but not during the emergency. So on the 23rd of December, all of this came together when the legislature passed an act called an additional act to an act entitled, well, it's an additional act to an earlier act about protecting the wharf on East Bay Street, to which they are going to repair and the building of more batteries and flankers on the said wall to be built on the said wharf, and also for fortifying the remaining parts of Charlestown by entrenchments, flankers, and palisadoes. So this is the beginning of the legal effort to fortify Charleston with a circle of entrenchments. And this is what we got. So if you've seen this map published in 1711 by Edward Crisp, so not surveyed by Edward Crisp, because he was a coffee roaster in London, but published by him at the Carolina Coffee House. This is the earliest known depiction of that system of entrenchments encircling 62 acres of urban Charleston. So this is what they decided to encircle with those entrenchments in that legislative decision in December of 1703. And if we take a little tour of this on the CRISP map, which I've talked about more on the Walled City Task Force website, each of these little points is identified. So let's take a quick walking tour. The wharf wall or curtain line, it started out as a wharf wall, but became a curtain line or connecting line that was part of the greater fortifications after the creation of the entrenchments. So that wharf line was started in the 1690s and was not originally part of the defensive system, but it was kind of adopted into the defensive system and remained part of Charleston's defenses for the rest of the colonial period. And Granville Bastion, I've circled there with red, that got started in 1697. And as I've theorized in a recent essay, that was probably the southeastern corner of a four-corner fort that never got finished. And then continuing there in counterclockwise order. No, not continuing counterclockwise order, in chronological order. The Half Moon Battery at the east end of Broad Street, again, as I said earlier, got built, started about 1700, 1701, and finished in 1702 before the legislature decided to surround the town. Craven Bastion, which is under the steps of the U.S. Custom House today near Market Street and East Bay Street, that was part of the entrenchment system designed in 1703, 1704. So Craven Bastion, even though it's built of brick on the waterfront, it's one of the last parts of the brick waterfront fortification that was planned and built. Skipping to the other side, to the south side of the town, Ashley Bastion was part of the system designed in late 1703, early 1704. And then Colleton Bastion, which is right next door or perhaps underneath the the Nathaniel Russell House near the intersection of Trad Street and Meeting Street. And there's a bronze marker for that next to the pillar in front of the Nathaniel Russell House. So that's approximately where the First Scots Church is, or the Nathaniel Russell House. That was the southwesternmost corner bastion of this system designed in 1703. And then the only way to enter and exit the town on the land side was through this ravelin called Governor Johnson's Ravelin. So a ravelin is basically a detached, fortified island. And so this is at the intersection of Broad and Meeting Streets. And actually it's more on Broad Street than on Meeting Street. And it actually has two drawbridges in there. So you come from out of town, you come down King Street and you go over a single drawbridge marked by letter K here, and you go across the drawbridge, across a little moat onto the little island and turn 45 degrees and go across another drawbridge into Broad Street and crossing Meeting Street there. And so that was the only way into town for a period of about 20 years. And then at the northwest corner is Carteret's Bastion. And by the way, all of these bastions were named by 1708. So they're created in the winter of 1703, 1704 on paper. The earliest reference I have found to the names of these bastions is 1708. So maybe they were built and named after they were built. And I want to talk just again briefly about what these things would have looked like. So here's a page from a 1747 textbook by John Mueller on how to build quick and easy fortifications, or field fortifications. And that's what he's describing here. And so this shows you kind of a bird's eye view looking down from above what those fortifications would have looked like. There's a moat on the outside and then an angled line and then a platform behind or below that line for the defenders to stand on. And here you see in the center of the screen a fortified ravelin, just like we had in Charleston. And here's a profile or section view of that same siege line, again, made entirely out of earth. And if you added brick or wooden revetment on the front slope of this ditch, then it would theoretically last longer. But what is being depicted here is a quick and easy, all you need is basically shovels and wheelbarrows to build this kind of fortification. And you can get some idea of the rough dimensions of what these things are. And we don't know anything specific about the dimensions of the entrenchments built in early Charleston that are depicted in this 1711 map. But I want to theorize based on what I've been looking at the real estate and the descriptions and reading a lot about fortifications. This is what I'm proposing got built. And this is something I've sketched up in a program called SketchUp, which you can download a free version on the internet. So you have to pick a volume of earth that you excavate. So a lot of the fortification instructions are based on divisions of 6 feet. So what the French called a toise, and here we call a fathom, 6 feet, 2 yards. A lot of the fortification instructions are based on divisions or multiples of 6 feet. So let's imagine a ditch that's 30 feet broad on the top, but only 18 feet broad at the bottom. And that was very typical because if you just dig in the earth, the maximum slope that you can have on the side with no revetments is about 45 degrees. So if you have a 45-degree angle, then 18 foot at the bottom and 6 feet below the surface, and you've got 30 feet at the top. So that's a very predictable kind of standard field entrenchment ditch. So perhaps that's what they had here in Charleston. Perhaps it was a little narrower, perhaps it was a little wider, but probably some multiples of 6-foot units. So if you take that volume of earth, 1 linear foot of that entire trench would be 144 square feet. So if you took a 1-foot slice across that entire trench, you'd have 144 cubic feet. So what do you do with that volume of earth? You stack it up, and you can only use the volume of earth you've excavated. So what I've drawn up on the left-hand side of the screen here is 21.5 feet wide and 10 1/4 feet tall at its tallest point. That measurement that I've drawn there is 144 square feet. If you measured a 1 foot slice through the entire section of it. So it's something that a man could not jump over, an animal can't jump over, but a musketeer or defender standing behind it can step down off of this banquette to the far left and load his musket and then step up to the banquette and fire his musket over the rampart and then step back down to reload. So no, it's not terribly tall, but it wasn't supposed to be very tall, because the taller your walls are in the age of artillery, the more of a target you are giving to your attacker. So the idea is to have a relatively low profile wall that protects the heads of the people who are behind that wall defending the town. So it's trying to strike a compromise between something that's not too tall that it's going to endanger itself or become a target, but tall enough to defend the defenders inside. So if you're looking at a satellite view of town, where were these fortifications? Where are those 62 highest and driest acres of urban Charleston? And I'm going to bring in here in the screen a 1721 map that we'll talk about in just a moment. And you can start to see the outline on top of this satellite view. And there it is. The streets still match up pretty well. And Broad Street is right smack in the center. And you can see that along Meeting Street, which is the right up here at the top of the screen, that Ravelin is just a little bit west of the intersection of Meeting and Broad Streets. And that was a very important crossing point. So it's the fairly large size triangular fortified island there. And here's the First Scots Church and Nathaniel Russell House over here. And you see that bastion there, identified as Colleton Bastion, is right smack on top of the First Scots Church. And the footprint of the bastion is at least as large as the footprint of the First Scots Church. So this is a pretty large piece of fortification. So when did this get built? We know they decided to build it in December of 1703, and by October of 1704, Governor Johnson says the entrenchments are in a great measure perfected. You know, those walls are nearly done. And we're going to need some more cannon because these fortifications are going to be useless without cannon. And I wanted to mention this because the point is they really never did have enough cannon to defend the town until decades later. And also by the autumn of 1704, there are already children and animals climbing over the entrenchment. And these are earthen entrenchments, so it's causing a problem. So the government passed a law in November of 1704 to prevent the breaking down and defacing of the fortifications. And it says, we spent a lot of money on these fortifications, and there are people already who are defacing them. So don't presume to climb and get over the said entrenchments and climbing in and out of Charlestown. You know, we spent a lot of money on these to protect the town, so let's not mess them up. And anyone who does presume or endeavor to climb over any part of the fortifications is going to face a hefty fine. And also at that same time, reviewing those accounts, there's a paper trail there that James de Longbois, and his name is spelled 20 different ways in the legislative records, he was paid for his industry in laying out and carrying on the fortifications. So whereas Samuel de Bourdieu appears to have designed the entrenchments, James de Longbois appears to have been the superintendent who was laying them out on the ground and supervising the digging of the entrenchments. He was had more of a hands-on role in this system of fortifications. So yes, these things were put to the test in the autumn of 1706 when a combined French and Spanish fleet sailed into Charleston Harbor, saw our fortifications, and then had second thoughts about attacking the town. So they did some good. And if you're not familiar with that episode, then check out my podcast on the Charleston Time Machine, podcast number 1. It's about 45 minutes of the whole story of the assault of 1706. But back to the fortifications. I want to get to the end of these real quickly. By 1712, they needed some fortifications. Carteret Bastion, for example, needed 4 guns. It was completely empty. The next flanker wants 2 or 3 guns. The gates, drawbridges, and that's why I want to show you this, drawbridges, plural, they need to be repaired by 1712. In all of the redans, there are several guns wanting. In Colleton's Bastion, there are breaches made in that earthen work. And in Ashley Bastion, other breaches to be mended. So these earthen fortifications needed periodic repairs, especially after the hurricane of September 1713. Thomas Lambull, in a manuscript cited by David Ramsay, says that the front wall and the mud parapet before Charleston were undermined and washed away with the platforms on which the guns were resting. Mark Catesby, in his description of Carolina, says that the hurricane of 1713 was so furious that it damaged the fortifications that were important to protecting the town. Governor Robert Johnson says, when he was a kid and his father was governor, he says the fortifications were ruined, completely thrown down and ruined by the hurricane of 1713. And other sources, like those legislative records, confirm this. The legislative record right after the hurricane says the entrenchments have been wholly washed away or undermined. So in serious need of repairs. But the legislature spent the bulk of its money repairing that brick wharf wall fronting East Bay Street. And then the very next September, there's another hurricane. And William Rhett tells us it does much the same damage as the previous hurricane. And Governor Craven in 1714 is telling people in England that the ruinous circumstances of the fortifications are a real liability for Charlestown. The repeated storms have quite demolished the fortifications of Charlestown. And then the Yamasee War prevented us from really spending much time spending money on those fortifications, because all the government funds were really directed towards fighting off that threat from various Indian tribes. But during that time, people like Abel Kettleby, who's in Charleston briefly, says that people are evacuating the countryside and coming to Charleston. Charleston is in a manner blocked up, so filled with people, refugees who are squatting in Charleston. The town is fortified and will hold out for some months against the Indians, but people are imprisoned within the mud wall, that is the earthen entrenchments of urban Charleston, because Colleton County, for example, has been completely evacuated. People, refugees are squatting in Charleston. And in 1716, we are actively paying enslaved laborers for repairing the fortifications of Charlestown. So there's a little bit of a paper trail. But because of, and I'm going to skip ahead real quickly, after the Yamasee War, there's the Revolution of 1719, and that bloodless coup overthrows the government. And there's a bit of colonial exchange here where King George sends Governor Francis Nicholson to be provisional royal governor. So there's a transitional period where the fortifications are somewhat questionable. They have been repaired in recent years. And this is a plat drawn by John Herbert in October of 1721. It's in the National Archives of the United Kingdom in London. And he tells us right up at the top of the screen, it's 62 acres. He drew this for Governor Nicholson to send back to England to explain to people in England how Charlestown is fortified. And so this proves to us that there are robust fortifications as late as October of 1721 in Charleston. And that's Meeting Street and Church Street and Bay Street. And there's also Trad Street and Broad Street and Queen Street. That is the extent of the town. Yes, there are people living outside of the walls, but these are the 62 acres fortified in 1703, 1704. Now, I want to close by trying to explain why I think these walls came down in 1723. I've been looking through the legislative records for that smoking gun, where the legislature who paid for these fortifications would say, okay, now it's time to take down the walls. We're done with these. and give an official order to dismantle them. But there is no such thing in the legislative records. The surviving legislative records have no positive information about taking down the walls. There are missing journals for the period 1729, 1730. So I thought for a long time, maybe they were taken down during that time period. When the new royal government officially commenced in December of 1730, they never mentioned the old fortifications of the previous government. And by 1734, the streets are being extended. People are building on new lots in Charleston as if those fortifications are gone. So they must be gone by that time. So I went back and I've been looking and looking at the legislative records. And here's what I found out. On the 23rd of June, 1722, the South Carolina government passed this act for the good government of Charleston. We actually incorporated Charleston for the first time under the name Charles City and Port. And this is the beginning of a new way to look at urban Charleston. Now, the British government basically flushed this law down the drain in June of 1723, and news of that repeal or cancellation of the incorporation arrived in Charleston on the 5th of October, 1723. But in that brief year and a half time period, Governor Nicholson and his friends had all these great ideas about how to improve Charleston. And it appears that removing the fortifications was part of that plan of improving Charleston. So for example, on Valentine's Day, 1723, there's a committee forming a budget for the coming year for the South Carolina legislature. And both the upper house and the Commons House of Assembly agreed to spend 2,000 pounds currency for removing the posts on the back of the city and moving those posts to the front part of the city. And I think this is the beginning of the end of those earthen entrenchments. So apparently the earthen entrenchments had wooden revetments, like wooden palisade or posts, keeping those earthen walls in place. And you start removing them and the walls start to disappear on their own. On the 5th of December, 1723, a legislative committee is talking about, in Granville Bastion, we've got some old gates timber, some stuff from the old drawbridge, and some old iron, which came from the back part of the town, as if the fortifications on the back part of town no longer exist. And they've moved cannon out of the southwest bastion. Used to be called Colonial Bastion, but now apparently it is gone or it's been dismantled. And on the 11th of February, 1724, Governor Nicholson tells the citizens of Charleston, don't presume to carry away any of the earth that formed the banks recently or lately of the fortifications around Charleston. So by 1724, they're talking about those banks of earth on the south and west and north parts of urban Charleston that used to be the fortifications. So there are banks still there, but they're kind of crumbling. And the governor and the assembly actually turned that into a law. So there's a fine for anyone who shall presume to take away or out of any of the street, any of the fortifications where the entrenchments or the trenches formerly stood. So the fortifications are being kind of passively eroded through the 1720s. By June of 1724, they're talking about the fact that we still need to fortify the town, but they've already kind of given up on the earlier entrenchments, apparently. So in those coming years, the final years of the 1720s, Governor Nicholson went back to England where he died. We have an interim governor here in South Carolina, and our government in South Carolina descends into anarchy. So 1728, 1729, there is literally anarchy in South Carolina. The government is completely dysfunctional. Nobody's sure who's in charge, and certainly nobody is paying any attention to the fortifications. And the fortifications, those earthen fortifications, are being pilfered. People are filling in their low lots with the old entrenchments. And by the time we get to the royal period, those 1703, 1704 entrenchments are really nothing but a memory. So for example, in July of 1725, John Lawrence sold town lot number 59 at the corner of Meeting and Chalmers Street. And the in that lot description, it says this lot fronts on the street by the fortification, or the street per the fortification. So by 1725, there's still some vestige of the fortification there, right in front of lot number 59, which happens to be the fireproof building where the South Carolina Historical Society is. So by 1725, there's across the street from the fireproof building on Meeting Street, there's still some vestigial fortification, but not much. By 1729, people here in South Carolina are complaining about the ruinous and defenseless condition of South Carolina. There is absolutely no tax money to build new fortifications or to remove the old fortification. The government is dysfunctional. We cannot protect ourselves. And then the royal government begins in December of 1730, and we start our first newspaper in January of 1732. And one of those earliest issues of the newspaper reminds people that in 1724, there was a law passed saying, how dare you take away any of the dirt from the banks where the entrenchments formerly stood. So the conclusion that I've come to is that they started to passively dismantle those entrenchments in 1723, but they're really kind of part of the fortifications, and they're still trying to protect them as late as 1732, unsuccessfully. So if we skip ahead to 1739, here's this published map of Charleston that shows the outline of the old fortifications. This is called the Ethnography of Charlestown from 1739. And there's a caption on the map that says the double lines you see here around the town represent the enceinte, that is the system of circling fortifications around urban Charleston, as fortified in the early days, but that were taken down in the year 1717. Which is an absolute lie. That's totally incorrect. Those walls were still standing after 1717, but a few years after that. And I found another clue in Gentleman's Magazine in the 1740s, published a short article about the case for protecting Carolina. And it says there, in Queen Anne's War, Charlestown was protected by some tolerable works on the land side, those entrenchments. But those entrenchments were raised by General Nicholson to oblige some of his particular friends. And I think that's absolutely true. During Governor Nicholson's administration, those entrenchments were allowed to go to ruin. So they're earthen entrenchments with wooden palisades, and they were allowed to disintegrate basically over the 1720s. By the early 1730s, they're useless remnants of what used to be fortifications and hardly worth even acknowledging, which is why I was not able to find a definitive end to those fortifications. So I hope that fortification conclusion makes sense. That early system of fortifications lasted from 1703 to 1723. And of course, Charleston had later fortifications during different wars with France and Spain, like you see in this 1757 plat. And like you see in this 1780 map of the American Revolution. Charleston was a heavily fortified town for 100 years. But today, I really just wanted to focus on the early system of fortifications that turns out lasted, as far as we can tell, from 1703 to 1723, and then began to decline. So I'm going to be writing more about this in an upcoming essay that I will put on both the Charleston Time Machine and on the Walled City Task Force blog site. Catherine, I know I've gone a little long, but I hope that I have drawn the conclusion that I promised earlier.
Absolutely. Well, I know we've got some questions right off the bat. I was going to just sort of note one thing that caught my attention was about Governor Nathaniel Johnson. And you can kind of see, if I didn't mention it in my introduction, I'm the director of the Powder Magazine Museum here on Cumberland Street at the sort of northwestern sort of edge of the walled city. And one of the things that we talk about quite a bit is that in 1703, Governor Johnson, who was this really kind of experienced military man, starts to endorse or ask for a powder magazine to protect the town. So while he's in 1703 advocating for a system of defense, he's also advocating for a powder magazine, which you see behind me, that's not built for another 10 years till 1713. But this is really, for me, really exciting to work here, because this is really the last above ground remnant of that fortification system that was once on the landscape of Charleston, and that's now mostly archaeological. But I did think that that was really interesting. And also, I feel like it's really new information about Deberdu and Langlois, because that we get the question all the time here at the Powder Magazine: who designed the fortifications and who built them? We have known for a long time, I think, that there was a fair amount of enslaved labor, a fair amount of eminent domain across private property. But really, really interesting to hear about all that. I do think it was interesting to hear about the low walls. That was something that we kind of talked about in the profile of low, squatty fortifications in this time period. That's something that we talked about last week with the St. Augustine. Even though that Castillo is huge, when you're really far away and looking towards the Castillo, it kind of melts into the landscape as a low feature when you're not right up on it. So really interesting. So I'm going to get to some of the chats here. We've got a lot of tour guides who kind of one thing that, this will be really interesting, and I should mention before anybody else peels away, I do hope everybody will come next time. We're going to be taking a Zoom to Quebec and the fortifications there, which I mentioned last time we're all very jealous of, because St. Augustine and Charleston, the encircling city walls are mostly archaeological, and in Quebec, they're right up on the landscape, and you can really see the scale. One thing that Eric, who's on this call, who'll be talking to us next time, asked Nick was, he had a question about the calculation of the entrenchment. Was there a glacis? If there was, the ditch could have been a bit wider.
Yeah. I haven't found any mention of a glacis on the outermost side of the ditch or trench during this time period. But in later fortification episodes in Charleston, like in the 1740s, 50s, are absolutely talking about a glacis. So there might have been one here. They just did not talk about it in the sparse records that survive.
Janie Colombo asked if the moat here or the bottom of that entrenchment was dry like St. Augustine. That was something that we talked about last time.
Yeah, so the surviving legislative records, which is all we have to go on, doesn't ever address that. But I presume they were intended to be a dry ditch, not intended to be filled with water all the time. Except that, as you know, in many places of Charleston, you start digging a hole, you're going to run into water. So kind of seasonally, they would have been wet, and seasonally, they would have been, partially filled with water in the lowest parts of the town. And also keep in mind that, if you walk the outline of these walls, they were very conscientious about picking the highest and driest land that would be the most defensible in case of an attack. So they purposefully cut off the lands that were wet areas, like south of Water Street, for example. So yes, there, especially on the south side towards Water Street, there probably is some water. And actually down towards Granville Bastion in the screen, if you look at this map in the bottom left-hand corner between Granville Bastion and Ashley Bastion, is just a series of palisades, because it was basically a marsh, and they knew that. So instead of building a solid wall there, they built a stockade wall in the marsh, because that provided a defense on its own.
I'll say too, archaeologically, at the drawbridge at Meeting and Broad, New South Associates in the late 90s did some, in the mid 90s, I guess, did some excavations on that site of the Charleston County Courthouse. And they did identify a feature which they thought may have been the ditch adjacent to the drawbridge. And they found a soil feature, which was a ditch that was kind of had a film of organic muck or debris inside of it. And they postulated that that muck or debris was probably because that entrenchment, it was designed to be dry, but as Nic pointed out, any kind of ditch is going to get wet and it's going to get leaf material and junk and all sorts of nastiness sort of sitting there with standing water, which is disgusting. May have had some bearing on why St. Philip's moved their church away from that back part of town and that whole nasty kind of drawbridge area. But we think we may have found at least the dry moat at the county courthouse site.
Yeah, so in a future program and future essay, I promise I will devote some time to just that ravelin under the county courthouse, and the evidence of the moat really helps us to literally triangulate where that is.
Well, Robin asked when we were talking about entrenchment and the sort of terminology for entrenchment, because I know we throw out things like moats and entrenchments. She was sort of asking about Fort Farallon up in Berkeley County. Would that have been termed an entrenchment or a fort because it was earthen?
Yeah, if it's an earthen structure, basically where you're removing a volume of earth to create a ditch and a bank that constitutes the body of the fort. Yeah, that's an entrenchment. So entrenchments in siege warfare are almost exclusively meant as temporary works. And here in Charleston, we circled the town in a way in which European military architects would have designed permanent fortifications. So entrenchments are typically temporary fortifications because they're made out of organic materials that you can put up pretty quickly and take down pretty quickly. And the elements in Mother Nature and the weather can destroy. So we used basically temporary methods and temporary materials to create a semi-permanent system of fortifications. And we did that because there was an emergency situation and they wanted to build quickly, and there's no stone. It could have been built out of bricks, but it would have taken many, many years. And they just chose not to do this at this time. They built out of brick at different periods in different locations. But in this episode, 1703 to 1723, it's basically a long-term temporary system of works. So yeah, Revolutionary War forts that are temporary in nature. Even if you call it a fort, it's basically a fort made of entrenchment.
So in that same vein, John Jameson was asking about, or just kind of noting the fact that the 1670 to 1680 fortifications on Albemarle Point that were pretty quickly thrown up, they were palisades or palisados. So we know already that they would have used palisades from earliest days, even before getting over here, correct?
Right. And, you know, and people who are settling Carolina are following the lead of what has already happened at Bermuda and to a certain extent in the Bahamas and in Barbados, except there's no stone here. So we had to make do.
It's funny to me, and we've talked about this after sort of really looking at the Castillo de San Marco and some of the fortifications in St. Augustine, that Bermuda stone is we use it on the later fortifications and in some early houses in Charleston, but we don't really see it, do we, on this early phase of fortification building, right?
No, not at all. And part of that is because of the hurry that they were in to build this stuff, and because of the nature of the economy at this time. They basically borrowed money they printed money to build fortifications, and that led to the earliest government debts in South Carolina. And they literally borrowed cannon from other colonies to fortify the site at this time, because it wasn't really until we became a royal colony that we got the cannon that we needed in the 1730s.
Interesting. Well, we've got lots of thank yous, and I think we've got lots of fantastic presentation, and thank you so much. And people are looking forward to their next visit to Charleston with this in mind. I will say, I think one of the, it is hard to visualize the walled city of Charleston on this landscape and get your bearings. Come to the Powder Magazine. We have a great 3D model. But I think one of the things that we hope to do with the Walled City Task Force, the Mayor's Walled City Task Force, is one day to delineate the lines, the bastions, the drawbridges, the curtain walls, everything on the landscape, on the streets and sidewalks, so that you'll literally be able to walk the perimeter of this first phase of the walled city. So, we got some other questions. Mostly thanks, and wonderful. But yeah, I think one of these days we'll get that done, Nic. But for now, this is the next best thing, is to hear your research, and we greatly appreciate it. So please, for everyone still hanging in there, don't forget, next week we're going to travel all the way to Canada, to Quebec. And after that, we'll kind of head out into the Atlantic to Bermuda and hear about the fortifications there. So we'll see you guys next week. And if you have questions, you can visit Nic through those websites and portals that he talked about, or you can get with me at the Powder Magazine. And we will see you next week.
Yeah,
all right. Thanks, everyone.